A single chair pulled up to a restaurant table, no one across from it. A train window with a stranger's reflection fading into empty countryside. A mountain trail with only one set of footprints pressing into the dirt. These are the images the world quietly avoids, because a person sitting alone, walking alone, deciding alone, looks to the untrained eye like a person who has lost something. In truth, that person may be the only one in the room who has found it. Solitude is not the absence of people. It is the presence of yourself, undiluted, unperformed, unwatched. For most of history, the philosophers who thought hardest about how to live a good life agreed on something uncomfortable. You cannot know what you are made of until you remove every audience and every witness and simply stand there alone with your own thoughts. Epictetus said, "He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." That same wisdom applies to company. A person who cannot enjoy their own has quietly built a life that depends on the presence of others to feel whole. That dependency is fragile. It cracks the moment those others leave, move on, or simply have a bad day of their own. And a life built on that kind of fragility spends its energy managing other people's moods instead of building its own foundation. The 10 practices that follow are not exotic. None of them require money most people don't have, or circumstances most people can't arrange. What they require is willingness, the decision to sit inside discomfort instead of immediately filling it with company, noise, or distraction. Each one strips away a layer of dependency and replaces it with something sturdier, the quiet knowledge that your own presence is sufficient. This isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting connection. Deep relationships still matter, arguably more once this work is done, because they stop being a substitute for a missing sense of self and start being an addition to one that already stands on its own. A person who has already learned to be whole alone brings something different to every relationship afterward. Presence instead of need, choice instead of dependency. Consider the alternative. A life where every decision, every meal, every quiet evening requires someone else's participation to feel bearable is a life quietly governed by other people's schedules and moods. That arrangement might feel comfortable for a while, but comfort built on constant company is not the same as strength, and the difference only becomes visible the first time the company disappears without warning. The 10 practices below are designed to expose that difference early, on your own terms, rather than waiting for life to expose it during a crisis. Each one is small enough to attempt this month and demanding enough to actually change something once it's finished. Here are 10 things worth doing entirely alone, at least once, so that dependency never has the chance to take root. 1. Eat at a restaurant by yourself. Sit down. Order the meal you actually want, not the one that photographs well or impresses whoever might be watching, because no one is watching. The waiter will not remember the table for 4 that became a table for 1. The couple 2 seats over is absorbed in their own conversation, not yours. The room, in reality, is far less interested in you than the anxious mind assumes. The discomfort in this practice has nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the story running underneath it, the fear that being alone in public reads as being unwanted. That story is almost entirely invented, built from imagined judgments that rarely exist outside your own head. Strip it away, and eating alone becomes what it always was: a meal, a pause, a small hour that belongs entirely to you, uninterrupted by the need to perform for company. Zeno of Citium said, "Man conquers the world by conquering himself." Conquering the imagined audience in a restaurant is a small version of that same conquest. It costs nothing but a little discomfort, and it returns something rare: proof that your own presence is enough company for an hour without needing anyone across the table to validate that the hour was well spent. Most people rehearse this fear for years without ever testing it. They order takeout instead, or invite someone along out of habit rather than desire, and the fear never gets to expire because it never gets challenged. One dinner, taken alone and finished without apology, does more to dismantle that fear than a decade of avoiding it. The plate gets cleared, the bill gets paid, and the story that once felt unbearable quietly loses its grip. There is also a quiet skill being practiced here, one that transfers well beyond restaurants. Learning to sit still inside a moment that feels exposed, without fixing it, without narrating it to anyone, is the same skill that later makes a person steady in a job interview, a first day somewhere new, or any room where they don't yet know the rules. The restaurant is simply the safest place to practice it first. The next time the table is set for one, sit down anyway. I am my own good company. 2. Take a long train or bus ride with no destination in mind. Choose a route, not a reason. Watch towns arrive and disappear through the window without needing any of them to mean something. There is a particular clarity that surfaces only when movement has no agenda attached to it, no meeting to reach, no itinerary to defend, nothing waiting at the other end demanding an explanation for the hours spent getting there. Cato the Younger was known for walking for hours through the countryside with no servant and no companion, using the distance itself to think through decisions the Senate could not make for him. He understood that motion without obligation clears space in the mind that stillness alone cannot reach. The body moves forward while the mind, freed from the pressure of arrival, finally has room to sort through what it's actually carrying. Musonius Rufus said, "It is not enough for a man who wishes to do well in life to have merely a certain amount of knowledge. He must also cultivate himself and practice diligently." Practicing solitude on a moving vehicle with a window and nothing else is one of the simplest ways to cultivate that muscle. The destination stops being the point. The hours themselves become the practice, proof that peace does not require arrival, only attention paid to whatever is directly in front of you. By the end of the ride, most people find the questions they carried on board have quietly rearranged themselves, not answered. Rearranged, sorted into something with a shape, instead of the tangled weight they were when the journey began. And that rearrangement is often worth more than a direct answer ever would have been. This is worth trying without a phone in hand too. A ride filled with music or scrolling produces almost none of this effect because the mind never actually gets bored enough to start sorting itself out. Boredom, uncomfortable as it feels in the first 30 minutes, is doing real work. It is the space where thoughts that usually get buried under stimulation finally get their turn to surface. Let the window teach what the itinerary never could. I find clarity in motion. 3. Live in a new city for a while. Somewhere no one has a fixed opinion of who you are, no inherited reputation, no old version of you that friends and family still expect to see walk through the door. In a new city, every interaction starts from zero. The barista doesn't know your usual order. The neighbors don't know your history. You are, for the first time in years, simply whoever you decide to be that morning, without the weight of anyone else's expectations pulling you back into an old shape. This is not escape. Escape runs from something, and it usually brings the same unresolved patterns along for the ride. This is construction instead, the deliberate act of rebuilding a life from the ground up, choosing which habits survive the move and which get left behind on purpose, one decision at a time. Seneca said, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." A new city forces that ending cleanly. It does not ask permission. It simply removes the old scaffolding and leaves the person standing in front of themselves, unlabeled, free to decide what gets built next without the interference of an audience that already thinks it knows the answer. Not everyone can relocate permanently, and that is not the requirement here. Even a season, a few months in an unfamiliar place does the work. What matters is the removal of the audience that already thinks it knows you. Without that audience, the only opinion left to satisfy is your own, and that shift alone changes how a person moves through an ordinary day. There is a specific kind of loneliness in the first weeks of this practice, before new routines settle in. That discomfort is not a sign something has gone wrong. It is the exact discomfort of construction, the space between the old identity being dismantled and the new one not yet finished. Sitting inside that gap without rushing to fill it is where most of the actual growth happens. Let the unfamiliar streets ask who you actually are. I rebuild myself without apology. 4. Spend an entire weekend without talking to anyone. No calls, no texts that turn into conversations, no small talk with the cashier that stretches past necessity. Just 2 days of near-total silence, broken only by the sound of your own footsteps and the occasional necessary word exchanged out of practicality rather than habit. The first few hours are usually the hardest. The silence feels less like peace and more like a room with the lights suddenly turned up too bright. Everything visible that used to hide behind noise. But push through those hours, and something shifts. The mind, no longer performing for anyone, starts to say things it normally keeps buried under conversation and constant social input. Marcus Aurelius said, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." A silent weekend is the practical version of that retreat. It is solitude with the volume turned all the way down until the only voice left in the room is the one that actually belongs to you, unfiltered by anyone else's opinion of what you should be thinking. By Sunday evening, most people report the same thing. The silence stopped feeling empty somewhere around Saturday afternoon and started feeling like company in its own right. That shift is the entire point of the exercise, and it rarely happens the first hour. It takes the full stretch of discomfort to arrive. Most people underestimate how loud an ordinary life actually is until they remove the talking entirely. Conversation, even pleasant conversation, is a form of constant low-grade performance. Choosing words, reading reactions, managing tone. A weekend without any of that isn't just restful. It's the first honest look at a mind that isn't managing anyone else's impression of it. Let the quiet say what the noise was covering. I'm comfortable in my own silence. 5. Solve a difficult problem without asking for help. Pick something genuinely hard, a repair, a decision, a piece of work with no clear manual, and refuse the instinct to immediately call someone who knows more. Sit with the confusion. Let it be uncomfortable. Work through it slowly, wrongly at first, and correct course only using your own judgment, even when the temptation to reach for a shortcut grows loud. This is not about rejecting help forever. It is about discovering, at least once, that you are capable of sitting inside a hard problem without needing someone else to hand you the exit before you've earned it. Chrysippus said, "Nothing happens without a cause, but everything happens according to a preceding cause." Struggle has a cause too, usually the absence of a skill not yet built. Solving something alone builds that skill directly, through friction, rather than borrowing someone else's already finished solution. The confidence that follows is different from the confidence that comes from being told what to do. It is earned in a way that cannot be handed off or taken back later. The problem itself often matters less than what survives it. The quiet, private knowledge that you did not fold the moment things got difficult. That knowledge stays with you long after the specific problem is forgotten, quietly reshaping how the next hard thing gets approached. Choose the problem carefully. It should be hard enough to genuinely resist easy solutions, but not so large that failure becomes catastrophic. The goal isn't heroics, it's evidence, a specific remembered instance where you stayed in the room with a hard problem and came out the other side having built something yourself instead of borrowing it. Let the difficulty teach what ease never could. I trust my own capability. 6. Spend one full day without your phone. No notifications, no scrolling, no reflexive checking during the small gaps between tasks. Just a single day where the device stays off or somewhere else entirely, and the hours have to be filled with whatever the mind produces on its own, without a screen standing by to fill every pause. The first hour will likely feel like withdrawal, because in many ways it is. The hand reaches for a pocket that no longer holds anything. But somewhere past that first hour, the borrowed attention starts to return. Thoughts that used to get interrupted mid-formation finally get to finish, uninterrupted by the pull of a notification. Seneca said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." A phone-free day is a small audit of exactly where that waste has been hiding. Most people discover uncomfortably how much of an ordinary day was never actually being lived, just consumed in fragments by a screen that promised connection, but mostly delivered distraction. By evening, the world outside the phone tends to look sharper, conversations land differently, food tastes more specific. The day, stripped of its usual distraction, turns out to have been larger than it seemed, full of hours that would have otherwise disappeared unnoticed. Pick a day with nothing urgent scheduled, so the experiment isn't sabotaged before it starts. Tell whoever needs to reach you in an emergency how to find you another way, then let the rest of the world wait. Most of what feels urgent on an ordinary day turns out by evening to have waited just fine. Let one unplugged day reveal what the noise was hiding. I own my attention. 7. Complete a physical challenge that scares you. A long hike with no support crew, a first marathon, a mountain that looks, from the base, genuinely unreasonable to climb. Something physical, something with a real chance of failure, undertaken without a team to carry the weight if it goes wrong along the way. Somewhere in the middle of that challenge, usually well past the point of comfort, the body starts sending a very specific message. Stop. That message is rarely about actual danger. Far more often, it is simply the mind negotiating for an easier version of the day, looking for any reasonable excuse to turn back early. Marcus Aurelius said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." The exhaustion is not the obstacle, it is the material the discipline gets built from. Pushing past the point where quitting feels reasonable is what separates a person who has tested their limits from a person who has only imagined them from a comfortable distance. Whatever the specific challenge, the lesson repeats itself the same way every time. The body can do considerably more than the mind is willing to admit, and the only way to learn that fact is to go far enough, alone, to find the actual edge instead of the imagined one. Choose something matched to your actual ability, not to prove a point to anyone else. The value here has nothing to do with the size of the accomplishment compared to someone else's. It has everything to do with the private, undeniable memory of finishing something your own mind tried to talk you out of an hour earlier. Let the body prove what the mind doubted. I do not quit when it gets hard. 8. Sit in nature for hours. No music, no podcast, no phone propped against a rock for company. Just a place outdoors, chosen deliberately, and enough time to let the initial restlessness burn off before something quieter takes its place in the mind. The first 20 minutes are usually loud, even in total quiet, because the mind keeps reaching for something to occupy it. Given enough time, that reaching slows down. Attention starts moving outward instead, toward the actual texture of bark, the direction the wind is coming from, the slow shift of light across the ground as the hours pass. Musonius Rufus said, "Nature has given to man an inclination to virtue that is so weak that it can be all too easily overcome." Sitting in nature, undistracted, is one of the few reliable ways to strengthen that weak inclination back to something solid. The natural world was continuing on long before any personal worry existed, and it will continue long after. A few hours spent inside that fact tends to shrink whatever felt unbearable an hour earlier without a single word being exchanged. The value of this practice rarely announces itself right away. It shows up later in the small, unhurried way a person carries themselves after enough hours spent somewhere that never once asked anything of them. A park bench works as well as a remote trailhead, provided the hours are actually spent there rather than treated as a stop on the way to somewhere else. What matters is duration, not scenery. 10 minutes barely scratches the restlessness. Several hours give it time to actually settle. Let the stillness outside settle the noise inside. I find peace in stillness. 9. Make an important decision completely on your own. Not out of stubbornness, and not because outside advice is worthless, simply because judgment is a muscle, and a muscle that is never asked to work on its own never actually gets stronger. At some point, every decision that matters will land on a desk with no one else in the room, and the only preparation for that moment is having done it before, deliberately in smaller stakes. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." That order matters. Decide who you are before consulting anyone else about what to do. A decision made entirely alone and lived with regardless of outcome teaches something that borrowed advice cannot: the specific weight of standing behind a choice with no one else to share the credit or the blame when the outcome finally arrives. Most people avoid this practice because the fear of choosing wrong feels heavier alone. But that fear is exactly what needs testing. The first solo decision is rarely the hardest one. It is simply the first proof that you can survive being wrong without anyone catching you. And that proof changes how every decision after it gets made. Over time, this practice builds something advice can never provide: a track record with yourself, one you trust because you were there for every part of it. Choose a decision with real weight, not a trivial one dressed up to look significant. A career move, a relationship boundary, a financial choice, something that will still matter in a year. Small stakes teach small lessons. This particular exercise only pays off when something genuinely rides on the outcome. Let the decision be yours alone to carry. I trust my own judgment. 10. Celebrate one of your victories alone. No audience, no announcement, no waiting for someone else to confirm that the achievement actually counted. Just a private, quiet acknowledgement that something difficult got finished, witnessed by no one but the person who did the work required to finish it. This is harder than it sounds. Most celebration has been trained to require witnesses, the applause, the shared post, the congratulations that make the accomplishment feel official. Strip all of that away, and the achievement has to stand on its own weight for the first time, with no outside voice confirming that it mattered. Cato the Younger said, "He conquers who conquers himself." A private celebration is the final proof of that conquest. It confirms that the victory was never really about being seen accomplishing it. It was about becoming quietly someone capable of the thing in the first place. That knowledge does not need an audience to be true, and it does not lose any of its weight for having no witnesses. Practiced enough times, this becomes a quiet form of independence, the ability to feel proud on your own terms without waiting for someone else's applause to make the pride feel earned. This doesn't mean never sharing good news again. It means, at least once, letting a victory exist fully before it gets shared, proving to yourself first that the accomplishment was real, independent of whoever eventually claps for it. Let the pride be quiet, and let it be entirely your own. I am proud of myself without needing applause. None of these 10 practices ask you to abandon the people in your life. They ask something narrower and, in some ways, harder, that you prove, at least once in each of these ways, that you can stand fully on your own before you choose to stand beside anyone else. The strongest people are rarely the ones who never feel lonely. Loneliness finds everyone eventually, in a hospital waiting room, on a long drive, in the quiet after a loss. What separates people is not whether that feeling arrives. It is what they have already built to meet it with, long before it shows up uninvited. Zeno of Citium said, "Well-being is realized by small steps, but is truly no small thing." These 10 practices are exactly that, small steps, each one unremarkable on its own, that together build something no single grand gesture could. The restaurant table for one, the silent weekend, the mountain with a single set of footprints, every one of these is an opportunity disguised as an inconvenience, and every one of them builds the same underlying strength. The ability to be your own company without apology and without waiting for permission. The version of you that exists when nobody else is watching is the version you will spend the rest of your life with. Every other relationship comes and goes on its own timeline, shaped by circumstances outside your control. That one relationship is permanent. Learn to enjoy its company now deliberately, one solitary practice at a time, and the fear of being alone quietly stops having anything left to hold on to. Carry this with you the next time solitude knocks. I have already met myself, and I am enough. If this gave you something to sit with, follow along for more Stoic wisdom.